If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1. The Making of a Revolutionary Mind. 1743 to 1776. Part 1. A Virginia Gentleman's Education. 1743 to 1767. A Virginia Gentleman's Education. 1743 to 1767. Thomas Jefferson's life began in the rolling hills of Virginia on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation. His world was one of vast tobacco fields, enslaved workers, and wealthy planters who ruled their lands like small kingdoms. His father, Peter Jefferson, owned thousands of acres and commanded respect throughout the colony. His mother, Jane, came from the powerful Randolph family, one of Virginia's oldest and most influential clans. Young Thomas lived surrounded by books, maps, and the constant hum of plantation life. His father taught him to ride, hunt, and survey land. More importantly, Peter Jefferson showed his son that knowledge meant power. The elder Jefferson could draw maps, read complex legal documents, and speak with authority about politics and business. When Thomas was 14, his father died suddenly. This loss shattered the boy's world, but also pushed him toward the books and ideas that would shape his destiny. Peter Jefferson's will demanded that his son receive the finest education money could buy. The family sent Thomas to study under Reverend James Morey, a brilliant Scottish minister who lived nearby. Under Morey's strict guidance, Thomas learned Latin and Greek until he could read ancient texts as easily as English. He studied French literature and mathematics. Most importantly, Morey taught him to question everything and trust only what reason could prove. The Reverend filled Thomas's mind with ideas about natural rights and the power of human thinking. At 17, Thomas entered the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia's capital. Here he met Professor William Small, a Scottish teacher who would change his life forever. Small introduced Thomas to the radical ideas sweeping Europe. These Enlightenment thinkers argued that government should serve the people, not the other way around. They claimed that kings ruled by the consent of the governed, not by divine right. Thomas devoured books by John Locke, who wrote that people possessed natural rights to life, liberty, and property. He read Montesquieu's arguments for separating government powers. These ideas felt dangerous and exciting. They suggested that common people could challenge kings and create better societies through reason and careful planning. George Wythe, Virginia's finest legal mind, became Thomas's mentor in law. Wythe taught him that good laws protected individual rights and limited government power. Under Wythe's guidance, Thomas learned to see legal documents as either protecting or threatening human freedom. Thomas read constantly, often 14 hours daily. His notebooks filled with quotes from radical philosophers and his own thoughts about government and human nature. He began to see Virginia's colonial system as outdated and unfair. Why should distant British officials make laws for people they never met? By 1767, Thomas had transformed from a plantation heir into a thinking revolutionary. His classical education gave him the tools to analyze government critically. His exposure to Enlightenment philosophy convinced him that legitimate authority came from the people's consent, not from tradition or force. This education would soon put words to colonial anger and create ideas that would reshape the world. Part 2. The Lawyer, the Builder, the Lover, 1767 to 1772. In 1767, Thomas Jefferson hung out his shingle as a lawyer in Virginia. The young man who had devoured philosophy books now faced the messy reality of colonial law. Case after case revealed how British officials twisted justice to serve London's interests rather than colonial needs. A farmer might lose his land because of some obscure English law. A merchant could face ruin from arbitrary regulations written by men who had never set foot in America. These legal battles opened Jefferson's eyes. He watched fellow Virginians lose their cases not because they were wrong, but because distant bureaucrats had stacked the deck against them. The education that taught him about natural rights now collided with a legal system that ignored those rights. Each court session deepened his anger at British rule. While building his legal practice, Jefferson fell in love. Martha Wales Skelton was a young widow with a beautiful singing voice and quick mind. She had inherited wealth from her late husband, but also massive debts that came with Virginia's plantation economy. Thomas courted her with music and poetry, and they married on New Year's Day, 1772. Their wedding brought him great happiness, but also financial troubles that would follow him his entire life. During these same years, Jefferson began his greatest personal project. High on a Virginia hilltop, he started building Monticello. This house would become his masterpiece, a physical expression of everything he believed about beauty, reason, and human potential. He designed every room, every window, every architectural detail. The house would never truly be finished because Jefferson kept improving it, always reaching for some perfect ideal. In 1769, voters elected Jefferson to Virginia's House of Burgesses. Suddenly, he found himself at the center of colonial politics. British governors kept dissolving the assembly whenever it challenged royal authority. Jefferson watched these power struggles with growing frustration. Why should one man in London tell elected Virginians what they could or could not discuss? The Burgesses met in Williamsburg's Capitol building, where heated debates revealed the deepening split between Britain and America. Jefferson mostly listened during his first years, learning from older members like Patrick Henry and George Washington. But he took careful notes and formed strong opinions about parliamentary tyranny. These experiences shaped Jefferson in crucial ways. As a lawyer, he saw British injustice up close. As a husband, he gained personal stakes in Virginia's future. As an architect, he learned to turn abstract ideas into concrete reality. As a politician, he witnessed the growing conflict between colonial rights and imperial power. By 1772, Thomas Jefferson had become exactly the man America would need in its revolutionary crisis. His legal training gave him precision with words. His personal happiness motivated him to protect his new life. His architectural vision taught him to build lasting structures. His political experience showed him how power could corrupt and how people could resist. The young philosopher was ready to become a revolutionary. Soon, distant events would call forth the pen that would change the world. Part 3. The Pen Takes Up Arms, 1773 to 1775. The winter of 1773 brought shocking news to Virginia. Boston colonists had dumped British tea into their harbor, defying the Crown's authority in the most dramatic way yet. Word traveled south through the colonies like wildfire. In London, King George and Parliament were furious. They would make the rebels pay dearly for this insult. Virginia planters gathered in their drawing rooms, debating what this meant for them. Many feared British punishment would spread beyond Massachusetts. They were right. By spring 1774, Parliament passed what colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These harsh laws closed Boston's port, stripped Massachusetts of self-government, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than colonial courts. Thomas Jefferson watched these events from Monticello, his mind racing. At 31, he had already served 5 years in Virginia's legislature. He understood law and government better than most. What he saw happening terrified him. If Parliament could destroy Massachusetts' rights today, Virginia's rights could disappear tomorrow. Jefferson picked up his pen. Instead of joining angry mobs or planning violent resistance, he chose to fight with words and ideas. He began writing what would become his first major political work. He called it A Summary View of the Rights of British America. The document was radical beyond anything most colonists had dared to say publicly. Jefferson argued that Parliament had absolutely no authority over the American colonies. None whatsoever. According to Jefferson, only colonial assemblies could make laws for colonists. The king might rule both Britain and America, but Parliament controlled only Britain. This idea shocked even many colonial leaders. Most still hoped to reconcile with Britain while keeping some connection to Parliament. Jefferson rejected any middle ground. He traced the problem back to the beginning, arguing that when their ancestors first came to America, they had voluntarily chosen to remain under the king's protection. But they never agreed to submit to Parliament. Jefferson's friends in the Virginia legislature were supposed to present these ideas at a colonial gathering. But Jefferson fell ill and could not attend. His colleagues took his written arguments anyway. Soon copies were circulating throughout Virginia, then beyond. People were amazed by the young lawyer's bold thinking and elegant writing. The document spread through all 13 colonies. Colonial newspapers printed excerpts. Political leaders passed copies hand to hand. Even in London, people read Jefferson's arguments with alarm. British officials considered charging him with treason. Here was a colonial nobody directly challenging the empire's fundamental authority. This writing made Jefferson famous overnight. Resistance leaders from other colonies now knew his name. They recognized him as someone who could express their deepest convictions with remarkable clarity. When Virginia needed to choose delegates for the Second Continental Congress in 1775, Jefferson's reputation secured his selection. In June 1775, Jefferson arrived in Philadelphia for his first Continental Congress. The city buzzed with tension and excitement. 2 months earlier, British soldiers and colonial militia had fought at Lexington and Concord. What had begun as political disagreement was becoming armed rebellion. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, delegates debated daily. Many discussions focused on military matters. How could colonial forces fight the world's most powerful army? Where would they find weapons, supplies, and money? Some delegates still hoped for peaceful resolution, but hope was fading fast. Jefferson contributed differently to these debates. While others planned military strategy, he focused on ideas. Why were colonists justified in taking up arms against their lawful government? How could they convince other nations to support their cause? What principles should guide their resistance? His fellow delegates quickly recognized his unique talents. John Adams called him the best writer in Congress. When committees needed someone to draft important documents, they increasingly turned to Jefferson. His pen was becoming Congress's most powerful weapon. As 1775 progressed, more colonists began accepting what Jefferson had argued the year before. Reconciliation with Britain was impossible. Parliament would never respect colonial rights. The only choice was independence. But independence required justification. The world needed to understand why Americans were breaking away from the British Empire. Jefferson's reputation as Congress's finest writer was growing precisely when America would need its most important document written. Part 4. We Hold These Truths. June-July 1776. When the Continental Congress convened in early June 1776, independence hung in the air like smoke from a burning building. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia had introduced a resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states. But declaring independence was one thing. Explaining it to the world was another entirely. Congress knew they needed more than a simple announcement. They needed a document that would justify their rebellion to other nations. They needed words that would convince foreign powers to support their cause. Most importantly, they needed to explain to their own people why breaking away from Britain was not just necessary, but morally right. On June 11th, Congress appointed 5 men to draft this crucial document. Benjamin Franklin was the most famous among them. John Adams had become known as a powerful speaker. Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston brought steady judgment. But when the committee gathered to discuss their task, they turned to the youngest member to do the actual writing. At 33, Thomas Jefferson had earned a reputation as Congress's finest writer. His pen would now craft America's birth certificate. Jefferson returned to his rented rooms on the 2nd floor of a 3-story brick house at 7th and Market Streets. The space was simple but comfortable. 2 rooms with windows overlooking Philadelphia's busy streets. Here, surrounded by his books and papers, he began the most important writing assignment of his life. For 17 days, Jefferson worked. He wrote on a portable writing desk he had designed himself. The words came from years of reading and thinking about government, rights, and human nature. John Locke's ideas about natural rights flowed through his pen. Enlightenment philosophy became revolutionary doctrine. Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal. He declared that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed. When governments failed to protect people's rights, the people had the right to change them. These ideas were not entirely new, but Jefferson expressed them with stunning clarity and power. His original draft went even further. Jefferson included a passionate attack on slavery and the slave trade. He blamed King George III for forcing slavery on the colonies and preventing them from ending it. These paragraphs burned with moral outrage at human bondage. But politics intervened. Southern delegates threatened to vote against independence if the slavery passages remained. New England merchants, whose ships had carried enslaved Africans, also objected. The unity needed for independence required compromise. Jefferson watched painfully as Congress removed his condemnation of slavery. This deletion would haunt America for generations. Congress debated Jefferson's draft for 3 days. They cut nearly a quarter of his words. They changed phrases Jefferson loved. John Adams later recalled how Jefferson squirmed as delegates slashed his prose. But the changes made the document stronger and more unified. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Church bells rang throughout Philadelphia. Jefferson's words had become America's founding creed, even as British warships appeared off the coast ready to crush this bold rebellion. Chapter 2: Statesmen of a New Nation, 1776 to 1789. Part 1: Revolutionary Legislator in Wartime Virginia, 1776 to 1779. Thomas Jefferson returned from Philadelphia to Virginia in late 1776 with fire in his eyes. Writing the Declaration of Independence had been just the beginning. Now he faced the harder task of turning those beautiful words about equality and freedom into actual laws that people would have to follow. Jefferson dove into the Virginia Assembly like a man possessed. He had a plan to tear down everything that made Virginia look like Old England and build something completely new. Over the next 3 years, he would write 126 different bills. Each one attacked a different piece of the old system where rich families stayed rich and poor families stayed poor. The biggest fight came over religion. For generations, everyone in Virginia had to support the Anglican Church with their taxes, whether they believed in it or not. Jefferson wrote his bill for establishing religious freedom, declaring that no government should force anyone to believe anything. The bill said that God made minds free, and no human power should try to control them. The Anglican priests fought back hard, calling Jefferson a dangerous radical who would destroy Christianity itself. Jefferson also went after the laws that kept rich families rich forever. Under the old rules, when a wealthy man died, his entire estate had to go to his oldest son. Younger sons got nothing. Daughters got nothing. This system, called primogeniture, meant that the same families controlled Virginia generation after generation. Jefferson's new law said parents could divide their property however they wanted. Suddenly, those great plantations could be split up among all the children. He attacked another system called entail, which prevented people from selling family land. Rich families had locked up huge areas of Virginia for centuries, keeping ordinary people from ever owning good farmland. Jefferson's law broke those chains, letting land be bought and sold freely. The young legislator also looked at Virginia's brutal criminal laws. People were hanged for stealing horses or even for smaller crimes. Jefferson proposed that punishments should fit the crimes. Why kill someone for theft when making them pay back double the amount would be more useful. Education became another passion. Jefferson believed that democracy would fail if people stayed ignorant. He proposed a system where every child in Virginia, rich or poor, could learn to read and write. The smartest students would continue to higher levels, creating what he called a natural aristocracy of talent instead of birth. But war kept interrupting his work. British ships attacked Virginia's coast, burning towns and disrupting trade. The state treasury ran empty, trying to supply Washington's army. Sometimes the assembly couldn't even meet because members had fled to avoid British raids. Despite these obstacles, Jefferson kept pushing his reforms through the legislature. Some bills passed quickly. Others, like his Religious Freedom Bill, would take years to become law. But he was changing Virginia piece by piece, proving that revolution could happen in courtrooms and legislative halls just as surely as on battlefields. These laws would echo across America for generations, showing how one determined man could reshape an entire society through the power of carefully chosen words. Part 2. The Darkest Hours. Governor during Invasion, 1779 to 1781. In June 1779, Virginia's Assembly elected Thomas Jefferson as their wartime governor. He thought his legal reforms had prepared him for leadership, but nothing could have readied him for what came next. Virginia's Constitution gave governors almost no real power. They couldn't command troops directly or raise money without the Assembly's permission. Jefferson inherited an empty treasury, broken supply lines, and the impossible task of feeding Washington's Continental Army while defending his own state. The job seemed cursed from the start. Virginia stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, making it nearly impossible to defend. The militia rarely showed up when called. Many men had already served their time and gone home to tend their farms. Others simply refused to march without pay that the state couldn't provide. Jefferson spent sleepless nights trying to squeeze supplies from counties that had already given everything they could. Then came Benedict Arnold, the American trader, now wearing a British uniform. In January 1781, Arnold's ships sailed up the James River toward Richmond, Virginia's new capital. Jefferson had moved the government there from Williamsburg, thinking it would be safer inland. He was wrong. Arnold's troops landed and marched toward the city with frightening speed. Jefferson frantically tried to organize resistance, but the militia melted away before the enemy even arrived. On January 5th, he watched helplessly as British soldiers torched Richmond's buildings and destroyed precious government records. The legislature scattered like leaves in a storm. Jefferson loaded his family into a carriage and fled westward, the smoke of his burning capital rising behind him. But Arnold's raid was just the beginning. That spring, Lord Cornwallis brought his main army into Virginia. Unlike Arnold's quick strike, this was a full invasion meant to crush Virginia once and for all. Cornwallis had thousands of disciplined soldiers and cavalry that could move faster than Jefferson's messengers could carry warnings. The British Army chased Virginia's government across the state like hunters pursuing wounded prey. Jefferson moved the legislature from town to town, always one step ahead of enemy scouts. He barely slept, trying to coordinate resistance while keeping the government functioning. But with each retreat, more legislators went home. The state was coming apart in his hands. The closest call came in June at Monticello, Jefferson's beloved mountaintop home. British cavalry under Banastre Tarleton thundered up the mountain roads, hoping to capture Virginia's governor and legislature meeting there. A young rider named Jack Jewett spotted them coming and rode all night to warn Jefferson. As British horsemen reached his front door, Jefferson escaped through the back, fleeing into the forest on horseback. The Virginia Assembly demanded answers. How had their state fallen so completely? Some legislators whispered that Jefferson was a coward who ran instead of fighting. Others questioned every decision he'd made during the crisis. Though they eventually cleared him of wrongdoing, the damage was done. Jefferson left office, broken and humiliated. The man who had written about equality and freedom had failed when his people needed him most. He withdrew to Monticello, convinced his public life was over. The confident revolutionary who had penned the Declaration of Independence now wondered if he was fit to lead anyone anywhere. His darkest hour as a public servant would haunt him for years to come. Part 3: Grief, Renewal, and the Birth of American Identity, 1781 to 1784. The death of Martha Jefferson in September 1782 destroyed Thomas Jefferson completely. For 3 weeks, he stayed locked in his room at Monticello, refusing to see anyone or eat properly. His wife of 10 years was gone, taken by complications after giving birth to their 6th child. The man who had written powerful words about life and liberty now seemed ready to give up on both. When Jefferson finally emerged from his room, he was like a ghost walking through his own life. Day after day, he would saddle his horse and ride through the Virginia countryside for hours, going nowhere in particular. His servants watched him leave each morning, wondering if their broken master would return by evening. The confident leader, who had once commanded respect in Virginia's halls of power, now couldn't even hold a simple conversation. His 10-year-old daughter Patsy became the only thing keeping Jefferson alive. She would sit quietly while her father stared at nothing, sometimes placing her small hand in his. Without her presence, those around Jefferson feared he might never recover from his crushing grief. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Jefferson began writing. French officials had sent him questions about Virginia's resources and society. Instead of brief answers, Jefferson poured his vast knowledge into what would become his only complete book. Notes on the state of Virginia grew into a massive catalog of everything he knew about his home state. The book revealed Jefferson's brilliant mind at work. He described Virginia's mountains, rivers, plants, and animals with scientific precision. He defended American nature against European scholars who claimed everything in the New World was weak and inferior. Jefferson proved them wrong with careful measurements and detailed observations. But the book also exposed Jefferson's troubled thoughts about slavery and race. He called slavery evil and harmful to both enslaved people and their owners. Yet he also expressed doubts about whether black and white Americans could ever live together as equals. These contradictions would follow him throughout his life. In 1783, wonderful news arrived. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the Revolutionary War. America was truly independent now. The Declaration of Independence that Jefferson had written 7 years earlier was no longer just a hopeful statement. It was the founding document of a real, victorious nation. This victory helped pull Jefferson back into public service. Virginia elected him to Congress in 1783, and he accepted the position. In Congress, Jefferson's mathematical mind created America's decimal money system. Instead of confusing British pounds and shillings, Americans would use dollars divided into simple units of 10. Jefferson also worked on plans for Western territories. His Northwest Ordinance established rules for how new lands would become states. Each territory would eventually join the Union as an equal partner, not as a colony. This simple idea would shape America's growth for generations. From the depths of personal tragedy, Jefferson had found his way back to serving his country. The grief would always remain, but so would his commitment to building the new nation he had helped create. Part 4: Parisian Enlightenment, 1784 to 1789. In May 1784, Congress appointed Jefferson as minister to France, sending him across the Atlantic to the most sophisticated city in the world. Paris buzzed with intellectual energy. Writers, philosophers, and scientists gathered in elegant salons to debate ideas that would reshape human society. Jefferson stepped into this world, still carrying grief from Martha's death. But Paris began to heal his wounded spirit. He joined Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in negotiating trade agreements between America and European nations. American farmers desperately needed markets for their tobacco, wheat, and rice. European merchants, however, protected their own interests through complex laws and taxes. Jefferson spent countless hours in meetings with French officials, trying to break down these barriers. Progress came slowly, often measured in small victories rather than grand breakthroughs. When Franklin retired in 1785, Jefferson became America's sole representative in France. The responsibility felt enormous. He represented not just a government, but an idea. The French watched America carefully, wondering if this experiment in freedom could actually work. Jefferson knew every diplomatic success or failure reflected on the entire American project. Beyond diplomacy, Jefferson immersed himself in European culture. He traveled south through France and into northern Italy, sketching ancient Roman buildings wherever he found them. The clean lines and balanced proportions of classical architecture captivated him. He filled notebooks with measurements and drawings, already imagining how these timeless designs could grace American buildings. These travels would later inspire his rebuilding of Monticello and his design for the University of Virginia. In Paris, Jefferson met Maria Causeway, a talented artist married to a wealthy English miniature painter. Their friendship sparked intense feelings that Jefferson struggled to understand. He wrote her his famous Head and Heart letter, exploring the eternal battle between reason and emotion. The letter revealed a side of Jefferson few people ever saw: passionate, conflicted, deeply human beneath his rational exterior. During these years, Jefferson witnessed something extraordinary. French society began questioning everything their ancestors had accepted. Why should kings rule by divine right? Why should birth determine a person's place in society? Jefferson watched with growing excitement as these questions led toward revolution. He advised his friend Lafayette as he drafted France's Declaration of the Rights of Man. Seeing American principles spreading across the Atlantic, the presence of Sally Hemings in Paris adds complexity to this period. She traveled to France as companion to Jefferson's daughter, but their relationship became something historians still debate. The freedom laws in France meant she could have claimed liberty there, but she chose to return to Virginia with promises Jefferson made her. On July 14, 1789, Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille fortress, launching the French Revolution in earnest. Jefferson watched the celebrations with joy, believing he was witnessing the dawn of a new age of human freedom. As revolutionary fervor swept France, he prepared to return home temporarily, expecting to return to Paris soon. He could not imagine that America itself would soon need his talents for challenges even greater than diplomacy. Chapter 3: The Partisan Wars, 1789 to 1801. Part 1: Reluctant Secretary in a Divided Cabinet, 1789 to 1793. Thomas Jefferson stepped off the ship in Norfolk, Virginia, in November 1789, expecting to enjoy a brief vacation at Monticello before returning to his post as minister to France. Instead, he found a letter waiting from President Washington that would change everything. The president wanted Jefferson to serve as the nation's first Secretary of State. After weeks of painful consideration, Jefferson accepted the call to duty. When Jefferson finally arrived in New York City in March 1790 to take his position, he discovered he was already too late. Alexander Hamilton had spent months building his vision for America's future. The young Treasury Secretary had charmed Congress and won Washington's ear with bold plans to fix the nation's desperate finances. Jefferson found himself the outsider looking in at decisions already made. The two men could not have been more different. Hamilton believed America needed strong banks, busy factories, and close ties with Britain to prosper. He wanted a powerful central government that could compete with European nations. Jefferson saw this path as betraying everything the Revolution had fought for. He dreamed of a nation of independent farmers who owed nothing to kings or bankers. Their first major clash came over Hamilton's plan to have the federal government pay off all the old Revolutionary War debts that states still owed. Jefferson watched in horror as Hamilton traded votes with congressmen, promising to move the capital south in exchange for support. This deal-making reminded Jefferson too much of the corrupt bargaining he had witnessed in European courts. Things got worse when Hamilton proposed creating a national bank. Jefferson argued this went far beyond what the Constitution allowed the federal government to do. Hamilton dismissed such concerns, claiming the government had implied powers to do whatever helped the nation. To Jefferson, this sounded like the same excuses British officials had used to tax the colonies. The whiskey tax pushed Jefferson over the edge. Hamilton wanted to tax farmers who distilled their grain into liquor, hitting the very people Jefferson saw as America's backbone. When farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelled against the tax, Jefferson sympathized with their anger, even as he condemned their violence. Jefferson found an ally in his old friend, James Madison, now serving in the House of Representatives. Together, they began organizing opposition to Hamilton's policies. They encouraged newspaper editors to criticize the administration and helped coordinate like-minded politicians across the states. Without meaning to, they were creating America's first political party. The situation exploded when war broke out between Britain and France in 1793. Jefferson saw revolutionary France as America's natural ally, a sister republic fighting for freedom against European kings. Hamilton preferred dealing with stable, predictable Britain, even if it meant ignoring old friendships. President Washington sided with Hamilton, declaring America would stay neutral in the European war. Jefferson felt betrayed. He had served Washington loyally, but the president consistently chose Hamilton's advice over his own. Federalist newspapers began attacking Jefferson as a dangerous radical who wanted to drag America into foreign wars. By late 1793, Jefferson had endured enough. The constant battles with Hamilton exhausted him. He felt like an outsider in an administration that had rejected his vision for America. On New Year's Eve, 1793, he submitted his resignation and headed home to Virginia, convinced his political career was over. He had no idea the real fight was just beginning. Part 2. The Philosopher-Farmer and the Storm Gathering, 1794 to 1796. Jefferson returned to Monticello in early 1794, determined to prove a man could find happiness without politics. He threw himself into the work of farming with the passion he once reserved for fighting Hamilton. Every morning found him planning crop rotations, testing new seeds, and recording soil conditions in careful notebooks. He built a nail factory that employed dozens of enslaved workers, turning Monticello into a small manufacturing center that produced thousands of nails each month. The house itself became his greatest project. Jefferson spent hours designing new rooms, planning clever gadgets, and directing endless construction. His grandchildren arrived for long visits, and he delighted in teaching them languages, mathematics, and natural philosophy. To anyone who would listen, he insisted his political days were finished forever. But politics refused to leave him alone. Federalist newspapers attacked him relentlessly, calling him a coward who had fled his duties. They painted him as a dangerous atheist who wanted to destroy Christianity and bring French revolutionary chaos to America. Some claimed he was secretly plotting rebellion from his Virginia mountaintop. Meanwhile, his Republican allies begged him to return. Madison visited frequently, bringing news that made Jefferson's blood boil. Hamilton's influence grew stronger each month. The government borrowed more money, created new taxes, and centralized more power in federal hands. Madison argued that only Jefferson could unite the opposition and save the Republic from monarchy. The Jay Treaty pushed Jefferson over the edge. When news reached America in 1795 that diplomat John Jay had negotiated a new agreement with Britain, Republicans exploded in rage. The treaty seemed to surrender American independence for British trade privileges. It ignored British seizure of American ships, failed to stop impressment of American sailors, and abandoned America's French allies. Jefferson saw it as proof that Federalists preferred British monarchy to American liberty. When Washington announced in September 1796 that he would not seek a third term, America faced its first real presidential election. The Constitution had assumed Washington would serve forever, leaving no clear process for choosing his successor. Reluctantly, Jefferson agreed to let Republicans nominate him against Federalist John Adams. The campaign became a vicious newspaper war. Neither Jefferson nor Adams campaigned directly, but their supporters launched savage attacks. Federalists warned that Jefferson would bring guillotines to America and force everyone to worship French revolutionary gods. Republicans claimed Adams wanted to crown himself king and marry his son to one of King George's daughters. When electoral votes were counted, a strange thing happened. Adams won with 71 votes, making him president. But Jefferson came second with 68 votes, which under the Constitution made him vice president. For the first time in history, a president and vice president from opposing parties would try to govern together. Jefferson packed his bags for Philadelphia, knowing the next 4 years would test whether American democracy could survive its own success. Part 3. Vice President in Exile, 1797 to 1800. Thomas Jefferson took his oath as vice president in March 1797, but he might as well have been walking into enemy territory. The Constitution said he was second in command, but everyone knew the truth. He was the leader of the opposition party, forced to sit quietly, while President Adams and the Federalists ran the country in ways Jefferson thought were dead wrong. The friendship between Jefferson and Adams had once been rock solid. They had worked together during the Revolution, spent years together in Europe as diplomats, and shared countless conversations about building a new nation. But politics has a way of poisoning even the deepest bonds. Adams was now surrounded by Federalist advisors who saw Jefferson as a dangerous radical. Jefferson watched his old friend drift toward policies that seemed to betray everything they had fought for together. The trouble started with France. The French Revolution had turned bloody, and now France was at war with Britain again. French ships began attacking American merchant vessels, demanding tribute and respect. Adams sent diplomats to Paris, but the French demanded bribes before they would even talk. When news of this insult reached America, the public exploded with anger. Federalists wanted war with France immediately. Jefferson found himself in an impossible position. As vice president, he had to watch silently as Adams built up the Navy and prepared for war. But Jefferson still believed France was America's natural ally against British tyranny. He thought the Federalists were using the crisis to grab more power and push America back into Britain's embrace. Every cabinet meeting felt like betrayal. Every war preparation felt like madness. Then came 1798, and Jefferson's worst nightmares became real. The Federalist majority in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws made it illegal to criticize the government. They let the president deport any foreigner he thought was dangerous. They made it much harder for immigrants to become citizens. Jefferson watched in horror as his political enemies used their power to silence opposition and protect themselves from criticism. Jefferson knew he had to fight back, but how could a vice president oppose his own government? He found a clever solution. Working in secret, he wrote the Kentucky Resolutions, while his ally Madison wrote similar resolutions for Virginia. These documents argued that states could judge whether federal laws were constitutional. If a law violated the Constitution, states could simply refuse to obey it. Jefferson thought he was defending liberty, but he was also creating a dangerous precedent that future politicians would use to justify rebellion. Behind the scenes, Jefferson was building something America had never seen before: a real political party. He used friendly newspapers to spread Republican ideas. He wrote hundreds of letters to supporters across the country. He helped create local political clubs that could organize voters and spread the word about Federalist abuses. Most importantly, he made an alliance with Aaron Burr of New York, a brilliant politician who could deliver crucial Northern votes. By 1800, Jefferson had created a political machine powerful enough to challenge Federalist control. The stage was set for an election that would determine whether American democracy could survive its first real test. The question was no longer just who would win, but whether the losers would accept defeat peacefully. Part 4. Revolution of 1800. Democracy's Dangerous Transfer, 1800 to 1801. The election of 1800 turned into the ugliest political fight America had ever seen. Federalist newspapers called Jefferson a godless radical who would bring French-style terror to America. They warned that he would shut down churches and let angry mobs run wild in the streets. They said he would steal property from honest citizens and hand it over to the poor. Republicans hit back just as hard. They painted John Adams as a power-hungry king who wanted to destroy American freedom. They called him a warmonger who would drag the country into endless battles with France. Both sides spread lies and half-truths that made voters fear for their country's future. When the votes were counted in December, disaster struck. Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr had tied with 73 electoral votes each. The Constitution's writers had made a terrible mistake. They forgot that electors needed to vote separately for president and vice president. Now, nobody knew which Republican should become president. The decision fell to the House of Representatives, where Federalists still held control. They had to pick between two Republicans they hated. Many Federalists despised Jefferson, but they found Burr even more dangerous. Some plotted to choose neither man, which could have sparked a civil war. For 6 days in February 1801, Congress voted again and again. 35 times they cast ballots. 35 times, no candidate got enough states to win. The country held its breath. Would America's democracy collapse before its 15th birthday? Alexander Hamilton stepped in to break the deadlock. Even though he considered Jefferson wrong-headed, he knew Burr personally and fought him completely without principles. Hamilton wrote letters to Federalist congressmen, urging them to accept Jefferson as the lesser evil. He warned that Burr would sell out anyone for power. On February 17th, the 36th ballot finally ended the crisis. Enough Federalists stayed home or cast blank ballots to give Jefferson 10 state delegations and the presidency. The man who wrote "All men are created equal" would now lead the nation. Jefferson's inauguration on March 4, 1801, offered healing words to a divided country. He declared that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, trying to calm the partisan hatred that had nearly torn America apart. He promised to protect everyone's rights, even those who had opposed him. For the first time in history, one political party had peacefully handed power to its enemies. Kings and emperors usually held on to power until death or revolution forced them out. But America had shown the world something new. Democracy could survive even when politicians hated each other. The Constitution had bent but not broken under extreme pressure. This peaceful transfer of power proved that American democracy was stronger than anyone had dared hope. The young republic had passed its greatest test. Chapter 4. Imperial President, 1801 to 1809. Part 1. Republican Simplicity and Practical Power, 1801 to 1803. When Thomas Jefferson moved into the president's house in March 1801, he immediately began changing how America's government looked and acted. Gone were the fancy ceremonies that Washington and Adams had used. Jefferson received foreign ambassadors, while wearing his everyday clothes and bedroom slippers. He got rid of the formal parties where people had to bow and scrape before the president. Instead, he wanted to show that America was different from the kings and queens of Europe. Jefferson believed the federal government had grown too big and expensive under the Federalists. He told his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, to start paying off the national debt as fast as possible. They cut spending on the Army and Navy, and Jefferson eliminated the whiskey tax that had caused so much trouble with farmers. He wanted to prove that a small, simple government can work better than a big, powerful one. But Jefferson faced a problem. The Federalists had filled government jobs with their own supporters for 12 years. Now Jefferson's Republican friends wanted those jobs for themselves. Jefferson started replacing Federalist office holders with Republicans, even though he had criticized Adams for doing the exact same thing. His enemies called him a hypocrite, and they had a point. The real battles happened in the courtrooms. Federalist judges and newspaper editors kept attacking Jefferson's policies. His administration fought back by prosecuting Federalist newspaper writers under common law. This looked a lot like the Sedition Act that Jefferson had opposed so strongly when the Federalists used it against him. The irony was impossible to miss. Then Chief Justice John Marshall made things worse for Jefferson. In 1803, Marshall's Supreme Court decided the case of Marbury versus Madison. The court said it had the power to decide if laws were constitutional or not. This made Jefferson furious. He had always worried about judges having too much power, and now Marshall had given them even more. But all these fights became tiny compared to what happened next. Napoleon Bonaparte needed money to fight wars in Europe. He offered to sell Jefferson the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. This was an incredible deal that would double America's size and give the country control of the Mississippi River forever. Jefferson faced the biggest decision of his presidency. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say the president could buy territory from foreign countries. Jefferson had always said the government could only do what the Constitution specifically allowed. Now he had to choose between his beliefs and his country's future. For weeks, Jefferson wrestled with this problem. If he refused the deal, Napoleon might sell Louisiana to Britain or Spain instead. American farmers needed the Mississippi River to ship their crops to market. This was the chance to secure America's future. But it meant using exactly the kind of expanded presidential power that Jefferson had always feared. In the end, Jefferson swallowed his principles and bought Louisiana. He pushed the purchase through Congress and acquired an empire. The man who had written about limiting government power had just used more executive authority than any president before him. Part 2. Exploration, Conflict, and Conspiracy, 1803 to 1807. Having bought Louisiana against his own principles, Jefferson now had to figure out what he had actually purchased. Maps showed blank spaces where the vast territory stretched westward. Nobody knew exactly what lay between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. This mystery excited Jefferson more than anything else in his presidency. In May 1804, two young Army officers named Meriwether Lewis and William Clark started up the Missouri River with 30 men. Jefferson had chosen Lewis personally, training him in botany, astronomy, and map-making. Their mission was simple yet enormous. Find a water route to the Pacific, map the territory, study the plants and animals, and meet the Indian tribes living there. For 2 years, the Corps of Discovery pushed through wilderness that no white American had ever seen. They spent a freezing winter with the Mandan Indians, where they picked up a teenage Shoshone girl named Sacagawea as their guide. She carried her baby son the entire way to the Pacific and back, helping the expedition survive in country that could have easily killed them all. While Lewis and Clark explored the western frontier, deadly drama erupted back east. Aaron Burr, Jefferson's own vice president, had grown bitter and desperate. Alexander Hamilton had blocked Burr's political comeback one too many times. On July 11, 1804, the two men met at dawn in Weehawken, New Jersey. Hamilton fired first, but missed. Burr's bullet found its target. Hamilton died the next day. The duel shocked the nation. Hamilton had been Jefferson's greatest enemy, but even Jefferson felt disturbed by this violent end. Burr became a pariah overnight. No respectable politician would associate with a man who had killed the former Treasury Secretary. Jefferson easily won re-election that fall, crushing his Federalist opponent in every state except Connecticut and Delaware. But his second term brought troubles that would test his principles once again. Burr, now finished in legitimate politics, began plotting something mysterious. In 1806, he gathered armed men and boats, then headed down the Mississippi River. Rumors flew everywhere. Was Burr planning to break away the Western territories and create his own empire? Did he intend to conquer Spanish Mexico? Nobody knew for certain, but Jefferson decided not to wait and find out. In 1807, Jefferson had Burr arrested and charged with treason. But then Jefferson made a crucial mistake. Before the trial even began, he publicly declared Burr guilty. This violated everything Jefferson claimed to believe about fair trials and the presumption of innocence. Chief Justice John Marshall, still Jefferson's judicial enemy, presided over the case. Marshall followed the Constitution's strict definition of treason and found insufficient evidence. Burr walked free, but Jefferson's reputation as a defender of civil liberties had taken a serious hit. Meanwhile, Britain and France were fighting their Great War across Europe's seas. Both nations began seizing American ships and forcing American sailors into their navies. Jefferson faced a terrible choice: fight a war America might lose, or find another way to make the European powers respect American rights. Part 3. Embargo, the Failure of Economic Coercion, 1807–1809. In June 1807, a British warship changed everything for Thomas Jefferson. The HMS Leopard stopped the American ship USS Chesapeake just off the Virginia coast. When the American captain refused to let British officers search his ship for deserters, the Leopard opened fire. 3 Americans died. 4 sailors were dragged away to serve in the British Navy. Americans were furious. War fever swept the country. Jefferson could have asked Congress to declare war, and most Americans would have cheered. But Jefferson looked at America's tiny navy and small army. He thought about Britain's massive fleet that ruled the world's oceans. America would probably lose a war against such a powerful enemy. Jefferson believed he had a better idea. If Britain and France needed American crops and raw materials so badly, he would cut off their supply. Economic pressure would force them to respect American ships and sailors. No more attacks, no more stolen men, and America wouldn't have to fight a war it couldn't win. In December 1807, Jefferson convinced Congress to pass the Embargo Act. The law banned almost all American exports. Ships couldn't leave American ports with goods bound for foreign countries. Jefferson thought this economic weapon would bring Britain and France to their knees within months. The plan backfired spectacularly. American farmers watched their crops rot in warehouses. Merchants saw their businesses collapse overnight. Sailors couldn't find work. Shipowners watched their vessels sit empty at the docks. New England's economy fell apart completely. Meanwhile, Britain and France barely noticed. They simply bought what they needed from South America and Eastern Europe. The embargo hurt America far more than its supposed enemies. Worse yet, the embargo turned Jefferson into the kind of leader he had always opposed. To stop smuggling, federal agents searched wagons and ships. They seized goods and arrested people. They used informers to catch lawbreakers. This was exactly the kind of harsh government power Jefferson had always criticized. Coastal towns ignored the law completely. Ships sneaked out at night. Smuggling became a booming business. Some New Englanders talked seriously about leaving the United States entirely. They had voted for Jefferson twice, but now they felt betrayed by his policies. Jefferson's own Republican Party began to split. Many members thought the embargo was destroying everything they stood for. Jefferson's popularity, once sky-high, crashed to earth. Americans who had loved their philosopher-president now saw him as stubborn and out of touch. For more than a year, Jefferson refused to admit his mistake. He kept insisting the embargo would work if Americans just waited a little longer. But the evidence was overwhelming. The policy was a complete disaster. Finally, Congress had enough. On March 1, 1809, just 3 days before Jefferson left office, they repealed the Embargo Act. They replaced it with a much weaker law that only banned trade with Britain and France. Jefferson never publicly admitted the embargo had been wrong, but privately he must have known the truth. His grand experiment in economic warfare had failed, leaving America weaker and more divided than when it began. Part 4. The Long Twilight at Monticello, 1809 to 1826. At 65 years old, Thomas Jefferson climbed into his carriage one last time and left Washington forever. March 1809 marked the end of 8 exhausting years as president. The partisan battles, the newspaper attacks, and the constant criticism had worn him down. He wanted nothing more than to return to his beloved Monticello in Virginia and never deal with politics again. Back home, Jefferson threw himself into farming with the same passion he once brought to politics. He wrote hundreds of letters to farmers and scientists across America and Europe. They shared ideas about crop rotation, soil conservation, and new plant varieties. Jefferson tested new plows, experimented with different seeds, and kept detailed records of everything. His farms became laboratories where he tried to prove that science could improve agriculture. The most surprising friendship of his retirement began in 1812. Benjamin Rush, a mutual friend and fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence, convinced Jefferson and John Adams to start writing to each other again. The two old revolutionaries had not spoken in years. Their political differences had torn apart their friendship during the 1790s. But now, as old men reflecting on their lives, they began an extraordinary conversation. Over the next 14 years, they exchanged 158 letters. They discussed philosophy, religion, politics, and their memories of the Revolution. Sometimes they disagreed sharply about what had really happened during those dramatic years, but they respected each other's intelligence and shared their deepest thoughts about life, death, and the meaning of their work. Jefferson poured his remaining energy into creating the University of Virginia. He had always believed that education was the foundation of democracy. Common people needed knowledge to govern themselves wisely. In 1819, the Virginia Legislature finally chartered his dream university. Jefferson designed every building himself, choosing the classical Roman architecture he loved. He personally selected each professor and created a revolutionary curriculum. Unlike other American colleges of the time, the University of Virginia would not require religious instruction. Students could choose their own courses instead of following a fixed program. Jefferson wanted to create a place where free inquiry could flourish without religious or political restrictions. But money troubles cast a shadow over his golden years. Jefferson's plantations never made enough profit to cover his expenses. He continued to live lavishly, buying books, wine, and elegant furnishings he could not afford. Worse yet, he had guaranteed a massive loan for a friend who defaulted. By 1826, Jefferson faced complete bankruptcy and the loss of Monticello itself. The Missouri crisis of 1819 to 1820 deeply disturbed his final years. When Northern congressmen demanded restrictions on slavery's expansion into new Western territories, Jefferson saw disaster ahead. He called it a fire bell in the night that warned of the Union's possible destruction. The slavery question he had avoided his entire political career was finally threatening to tear apart everything the Revolution had built. On July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello, around 12:50 in the afternoon. Hours later in Massachusetts, John Adams also died. Adams's last words were reportedly, Thomas Jefferson survives, not knowing his old friend had already passed away. Their deaths on the same day seemed almost too perfect to believe. The last two giants of the Revolution had departed together on the Declaration's birthday, leaving behind a complex legacy for future Americans to judge and understand.